I mean, like I kind of laid out in the book, like a bit like there's a very like quite obvious roadmap. Is like, okay, say you're like, I use the example is like, right, say you want to turn Essex into a car park, right? You've got to like amass some wealth like through hard work or inheritance. Like you can find yourself like a think tank or charitable organization. You can call it like, I don't know, the Center for Radical Innovation. Then you got to like make a report on all the social and economic benefits of turning Essex into a car park, and then throw yourself a nice like charity event, hire some lobbyists, and maybe even like you can hire a relevant like MP or government minister, at some sort of extravagant salary at a few hours a month in order to have their ear. And then it bypasses all of the usual channels for like making decisions that we would normally expect politicians to rely on. Instead of like talking to some constituents and phoning up some experts or listening to some testimony in parliament, that they just sort of go straight to the IEA ball and look at the policy papers that they're producing. And it has this weird effect of like pulling the apparent like public conversation like way to the right, like way to the right in economic issues, at least anyway. And how how effective do you think like this is? As this would this like shift to the right have happened anyway, perhaps, or do you think that this like you can legitimately attribute like a lot of these sort of more extreme policy ideas as coming into the mainstream solely because of this network of think tanks?
They definitely have an influence for sure. I mean, they wouldn't keep getting funded, they wouldn't keep working hard to do what they do if they weren't having some sort of influence on the pool. But I think it is important to acknowledge that a confluence of factors. So, firstly, economic crisis happened, so it kind of broke open, British politics to allow views that weren't kind of this centrist, kind of mainstream neoliberal kind of approach to suddenly get a voice, because people started questioning whether or not that was a legitimate approach to running the country, running the economy. So that kind of broke open the space. And then, of course, you had the Brexit debate, which again kind of hailed this new era of kind of, well, nonsense is one way to put it, polarization, misinformation, media panic because no one really understood, media desperation to demonstrate what we would describe as false balance. And being an environmental journalist, I've been fantastically familiar with false balance for a very long time. On climate change, you interview a climate scientist and a climate skeptic. Well, that's not balance, that's false balance. But there was some sort of desperation among the media hierarchy, the mainstream media hierarchy around Brexit to try and provide a similar thing on the Brexit debate, which didn't really represent the full spectrum of views. It just ended up being incredibly polarizing. And then you had politicians coming to the fore. Boris hitched his wagon to Brexit. And, there's been plenty better accounts written of whether or not he's a true Brexiter at heart, or if this was political opportunism. But whatever it was, he hitched his horse to that wagon, and he's now had to ride it. And so it created this space. So that's basically what happens. It created this space, this political space for these organizations. And then, of course, there was kind of, once the referendum happened and we got the result to leave, there was a complete vacuum of expertise. So no one really had done sophisticated analysis of how we do Brexit. I don't think that's a secret. And I think blame is across the spectrum there for that fact, really. But nonetheless, there was this huge vacuum. And then where there's a vacuum, these groups, these kind of tougher groups, that's their absolute dream. Because as you say, they can step in and say, I've got a policy paper for that. I've got working paper for that. We have some talking points. So don't worry, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, you can go stand in front of the camera and here are 5 talking points that we've already got prepared for you. Don't even worry about reading the research. Like, here you go. This is just what you say, right? And all of that stuff could have come from an industry-funded research paper, like you say, someone with deep, and if not industry-funded, then someone with deep pockets who presumably has an interest in them writing this stuff. So that's basically what happened. And so through this vacuum, they filled that vacuum and they continue to fill that vacuum. And as you say, there's a huge amount of crossover. So Number 10 immediately started hiring when Boris became Prime Minister, immediately started hiring from, the Leave the former vote leave infrastructure. A bunch of people went in from there. A bunch of people went into Liz Truss's office from the vote leave infrastructure and from the Tufton Street infrastructure. So these people, having suddenly kind of been on this fringe, mainly providing talking points, mainly being talking heads on media programs, suddenly found themselves putting themselves into these offices of power essentially and having influence. So events kind of led to their influence, which led to more events, which has led to more influence, if that makes sense. And while politics is cyclical to a certain extent, I do think there's a counterfactual where that didn't happen, and where these groups didn't have their influence and didn't kind of perpetuate the current politics that we're experiencing.
The current is the former conservative Robert Halfon actually credited the Thatcher's success or even her initial election as being because of the think tanks. So they've definitely had some sort of influence on British politics. I mean, I guess the media are probably as complicit in giving them the platform to say what they want, but yeah, it's difficult to say. What would you say is the most obvious or egregious example of them essentially manufacturing consent, to steal a phrase from Noam Chomsky, manufacturing consent for these policies? What's what's their greatest success?
That's a very good question. I think one of the greatest successes was basically them reframing a trade deal with the EU that went along the lines of kind of what we had pre-Brexit as a bad thing. And the reason that they did that, and you mentioned it up top, pushing for these kind of WTO style or Canada Plus style deal or whatever it is, it goes back to their core ideology, which is anti-regulation. So the EU brought in a load of regulations, some of which are good, some of which aren't. You can have your own opinions on them, but it's basically a bureaucratic body that tried to standardize and in general improve certain standards. And these groups don't like that. They don't like that. They want the free market to sort it out themselves. And so when Brexit happened, it was a fantastic opportunity to essentially rip all that up. And they were, fairly transparent about this. They produced these policy papers that are basically saying this is a fantastic opportunity for us just to rip up the rulebook and start again. And if you rip up a rulebook, it's an awful lot quicker to write a shorter rulebook to replace it than it is to go through and replace it line by line, an awful lot easier. And then that basically gives the people we suspect are their funders, but certainly the people who share their ideology and the people who tend to fund the types of politicians, so big business, big industrial businesses, people who might suffer from things such as environmental regulations, it creates the space then for them to redraw the rules and kind of have a playing field that very much favors them.
How pervasive do you think this web of kind of influence is able to how pervasive do you think it is across the entire ruling class, especially essentially of Britain? Because I mean, right now, it's very easy to feel like this, the basically free market neoliberalism as they sort of believe it is just that's just the top policy of both of the two major parties at the minute. Keir Starmer has managed to leapfrog Rishi Sunak, and go in his drift to the right. I'm not sure exactly how that happened. They've got completely blinded there. Keir Starmer comes out, it's there will be no raise in corporation tax under Labour. We wouldn't do that. And then Rishi Sunak raised it 25%. You just sat there being wow, you just got played, son. So how pervasive do you think this web of influence is? Do you think it's exclusive to the one particular faction of the Conservative Party, or do you think it's got sort of tendrils across the whole political spectrum?
It's very pervasive. It's very pervasive in the ruling class, for sure, as you put it. I think the critical thing is that all of this takes money. So kind of sounds like an obvious thing to say, but all of this takes money. So the people it's going to have most influence with are those who are probably already ideologically bent to helping people who have money either keep or make more money. So I think that's where the ideological differences tend to come from. It's not necessarily that these people wouldn't, influence a Labour government, for example. If, as you say, if a Labour government came in with some sort of opening for them to have policies that they felt suited their interests, well, I'm absolutely certain they would work with those people as well. It's just that at the moment in the current policy we have, there's a particular large, powerful, they're in Downing Street, section of the Conservative Party who are doing all this. So they're very much in bed with them, and that has tended to be the people and the politicians they've tended to be in with all the time, because they were always the most likely to deliver on their goals. And there is a certain sleeper element to this as well, which I think people sometimes forget. So some of these groups were a little bit of a joke for 5 or 6 years before, Brexit started to happen, and before they even kind of entered onto the table as a conversation, and before Cameron sort of started his lurch towards the right. They were kind of a little bit of a joke, but they remained funded. They were still out there. They kept their profiles up. They kept their kind of research base up. And that's because there was going to be a moment in history where they became useful. And that moment in history was the Brexit referendum, followed by Boris Johnson's government. And all of these people now who spent what isn't necessarily a huge amount of money to them on keeping these organizations alive for a decade where maybe they weren't having that much influence, are now seeing that being paid, 100-fold, having the return on their investment that we could only dream of, right? So I think there was also that element too. And again, that takes money. You do have to question whether the other side of the political spectrum or other sections of the political spectrum have the resources to essentially keep this kind of network alive for a bunch of years where it's not really paying off, whereas this side of the political spectrum clearly do.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.